welcome to the podcast on our channel Mustard Seed, the podcast where small seeds of faith grow into mighty seeds of truth. I am Shivanshu and I'm so glad you're here with me today. In this episode, we are going to dive into the incredible story of two women whose courage and faith saved countless lives. You may not hear about them often, but their names, Shiphrah and Puah, are etched in the pages of scripture as a testament to what it means to stand for righteousness. Before we dive into their story, here's our key verse for today. But the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Exodus chapter 1 verse 17. Let's uncover how these midwives not only defied one of history's most powerful rulers, but also set a powerful example for us in our own lives. To understand Shiphrah and Puah's story, we need to go back to ancient Egypt, where the Israelites lived as foreigners. The Israelites were the descendants of Jacob, also known as Israel, and they had settled in Egypt during the time of Joseph, who had risen to power under Pharaoh. At first, their presence in Egypt was welcomed, but as generations passed, a new Pharaoh came to power who did not know about Joseph and his contributions. He saw the growing number of Israelites as a threat. Exodus 1:9-10 records Pharaoh's concern. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become too far numerous for us. Come, we may deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." Pharaoh's solution was oppressive. He enslaved the Israelites, forcing them into hard labor, building cities, and working in the fields. But despite his efforts, the Israelite population continued to grow. This led Pharaoh to devise an even more sinister plan. Pharaoh's fear turned into a brutal decree. He ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill every male child born to an Israelite woman. This is where Shiphrah and Puah enter the story. Let's pause for a moment to consider their position. Shiphrah and Puah were midwives, likely overseeing other midwives. Their role was to assist in childbirth, a role centered on bringing life into the world, but now they were being commanded to become instruments of death. Pharaoh's order was absolute. In the ancient world, disobeying a king could mean certain death, and yet Shiphrah and Puah faced a choice: obey Pharaoh or obey God. Exodus 1:17 tells us what they choose. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Their decision was a direct act of defiance against one of the most powerful rulers in history. Why did they do it? Because they feared God more than Pharaoh. They recognized a higher authority. Let's talk about the courage it took for Shiphrah and Puah to make this choice. Imagine the pressure they faced. Pharaoh was not just a political leader. He was considered a god in Egyptian culture. Disobeying him was seen as blasphemy. They likely knew they were putting their lives on the line. And yet, their fear of God outweighed their fear of Pharaoh. But what does it mean to fear God? It isn't about being afraid of him. It's about reverence, awe, and a deep understanding that God's authority is ultimate. Shiphrah and Puah understood that obeying God meant protecting life, not destroying it. Their choice wasn't just a moment of bravery, it was an act of faith. They trusted that God would honor their decision to stand for what was right. Pharaoh eventually noticed that his plan wasn't working. The male infants were still being born and surviving. He summoned Shiphrah and Puah and demanded an explanation. The response, recorded in Exodus 1:19, was clever. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. This response brought them time and possibly protected them from Pharaoh's wrath. More importantly, their faithfulness did not go unnoticed by God. Exodus 1:20-21 says, "So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own." In a culture where midwives were often childless and families were seen as a blessing, God blessed Shiphrah and Puah with families, a tangible reward for their courage and obedience. The story of Shiphrah and Puah may be thousands of years old, but its lessons are timeless. Let's unpack 3 key takeaways that apply to us today. Number 1, stand for what is right even when it's hard. Shiphrah and Puah's courage reminds us that doing what is right isn't always easy, especially when it comes at great personal risk. They likely understood that obeying God might come with earthly risks, but their actions reflected a faith that transcended immediate consequences, emphasizing an eternal perspective over temporal fears. In our lives, we might face situations where we are pressured to compromise our values. Their story challenges us to remain steadfast. Number 2, fear God above all else. The midwives' decision was rooted in their reverence for God. This kind of fear isn't about dread or anxiety, but about acknowledging that God's authority surpasses all earthly powers. Their fear of God meant they valued His moral law, the sanctity of life, above the edicts of Pharaoh. They recognized that God's authority was higher than Pharaoh's and that obeying God's command to preserve life was paramount. Number 3, trust God to honor your obedience. Shiphrah and Puah did not know how their story would end. They couldn't see the outcome when they chose to defy Pharaoh. Similarly, we may not see immediate results when we obey God, but we can trust that He sees and rewards faithfulness. So, how can we apply the story of Shiphrah and Puah to the challenges we face today? Here are a few practical examples. Standing for life and justice. Whether it's advocating for the vulnerable, speaking out against injustice, or simply standing up for someone in need, their story reminds us to value life and protect the powerless. Defying ungodly systems. Like Shiphrah and Puah, we may find ourselves in systems or situations that contradict God's principles. Their story inspires us to act with courage and wisdom, trusting God in uncertainty. Obedience to God often requires stepping into the unknown. Just as the midwives trusted God, we too can rely on His faithfulness. Shiphrah and Puah's story is a powerful reminder that no act of faithfulness is too small. These women weren't warriors, prophets, or rulers. They were midwives, ordinary women in the society, or maybe even less than ordinary, but doing extraordinary things because they trusted God. Their courage changed the course of history, preserving the line that would eventually lead to Moses and ultimately to Jesus. Let's close with this thought. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act in faith despite fear. Ordinary people can show great courage. Shiphrah and Puah didn't just save lives, they showed us what it means to honor God above all else. Thank you for joining me on Mustard Seed. If this episode encouraged you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear how this story speaks to you. Until next time, remember, even the smallest seed of faith can grow into something extraordinary. God bless you.